Hey everyone, and thanks for stopping by this presentation today. We're going to talk about sales and marketing alignment and how to improve it with a concept called operational empathy. Working in MOPs is hard enough as it is, and not feeling understood or valued by other teams makes that even harder. At the same time, how can you expect to be understood by another team if you yourself don't really understand the challenges of those other teams? This presentation is designed to give you an actionable framework to better understand how to uplevel your skills, communication, and leadership visibility with related go-to-market teams. The goal of the presentation is for you to leave with a clear action plan to improve alignment. While you may not have heard of operational empathy before, I'm fairly confident that you have leveraged some components of operational empathy without knowing it. In just a few moments, we'll get into exactly what that is. But for now, I'll say operational empathy is when you show that you understand the challenges of a related team. And you do that by actively participating in the related team's tools, tech, and enablement, as well as directly challenging them. One last thing before we get started. The content here isn't just for MOPS pros, even though I know that that's the majority of the audience today. It's really for anyone that works in a RevOps or a go-to-market function and that is struggling to have more traction with related teams. So I'd like to introduce myself. Hey, I'm Adam. Right now, I'm a senior RevOps consultant in demand strategist at GoNimbly. I know that's a mouthful, but I do wear quite a bit of hats. I serve on the consulting team as well as help the marketing and revenue teams internally as well. And I've hung out in the MOP space for the last 7 years. For me, it was love at first, Marketo login, and I never really looked back. And I've had the pleasure of working at smaller organizations, startups, as well as larger enterprise organizations, and as well as different marketing and sales operations agencies. I'm a 2-time Marketo certified expert and certified Salesforce admin, passionate about being a generalist as I evolve my skill set in sales and marketing operations. And I'm also on a never-ending journey to bring sales and marketing together. I don't quite understand why they don't always get along, and I've learned a lot along the way. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of my story and some tips and tricks that I've found along the way. So here's what we can expect to cover in today's presentation. There's going to be 4 key areas. The first, we're going to talk about what happens when sales and marketing teams aren't aligned and the pains that we feel in that misalignment and with those silos. And secondly, we're going to talk about some typical alignment strategies and why they end up creating silos. And what we mean by this is, as we know, in an attempt to bring go-to-market teams together, a lot of times they'll just have shared goals or they're sort of forced in the room together. We know that that doesn't always work out for the best. It creates tensions and silos, and things can sometimes end up worse off than before they started. We'll then also move into this strategic and tactical applications of empathy. I know you hear the word empathy and you think, oh, I don't know about that. There are ways that it can be applied strategically and tactfully, and we'll definitely get into that today. And my favorite part is how we're going to leverage this concept of technical empathy for better alignment. So you will leave with some takeaways and some next steps. So let's talk about when sales and marketing teams are not aligned. So we see a few different things happen here. First of all, there's unfair assumptions. So MOPS is viewed as a rigid cost center. We feel misunderstood. Other folks in the organization don't really understand what we do, and don't see the revenue impact and things like that. Another thing that happens is diminished authority. And so this shows up with just SLAs not being followed, procedures not being followed, People don't want to follow the naming convention because they just think that they just need to get the stuff in the system. And obviously that wreaks a lot of havoc for us, and it is not fun. Another thing that can happen is a blame game. So something totally outside of our control goes wrong in the system, and it really had nothing to do with anything that we did or planned for. But it's like, oh, those MOPs folks. Lastly, and probably most importantly, is ultimately the go-to-market teams don't perform as they should. They don't meet their targets, and in general, revenue suffers. So if you are able to gain better alignment, you can definitely expect to see a lift in these core areas that tend to be gaps for us. And before we get into more of what is operational empathy and how can we use it, I'd like to juxtapose it with conventional sales and marketing strategies and kind of what those gaps are. We first saw this evolve with like shared lead definitions and life cycle. So we have sales, and marketing kind of brought together in sort of a linear or a more organized format. And then we also start to see shared goals and KPIs. And this often looks like focusing less on MQLs and more on meetings held or, influence opportunities from marketing. And so both teams are sort of held to a revenue target versus, different specific targets to that team. So for marketing, it would be MQLs. For sales, it'd be SQLs. So we're kind of moving past that and looking further down the funnel at, what does success look like when those teams work together? And then also knowledge transfer. So this definitely looks like marketing doing research and sharing that with sales, enabling them, and then also sales, kind of giving marketing feedback on, quality of leads and things like that. And the reality is these tactics alone, really create some gaps. If you think of like an Easter egg hunt, when I started thinking about this presentation, it was around April. It's kind of chaotic. It's wild. People are just kind of grabbing for things. And, just because you give someone a goal doesn't mean that folks will align and understand each other and think strategically together. All right. So now we're going to start the fun. And the first thing that I would like you to do is get quantitative. So you'll want to pick your counterpart team. And so again, I think the majority of us are MOPS pros, but if you're not on a MOPS team, that's perfectly fine. What you want to do is pick another team that you think, hey, I'm not really feeling aligned. And, so you take that team. And then for each of these prompts, you're going to score that other team or your relationship with that team on kind of a 1 to 10. So 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest. And you'll write that down. So, grab a pen, grab a phone, grab a notepad on your computer. Sidebar, if you're anything like me, you have like 1,000 notes in your computer. And, score these and then just take a quick average. I don't know about you. I'm not a big math person. So use that calculator function on your phone or your computer. And I'll pause here for a few seconds and just kind of let folks think about that. And if you can, share your number in the chat. And if anybody has like an 8 or higher, good news, you can just pack up and walk away. You're aligned with your other go-to-market teams. Don't worry about it. All right. Thanks so much for providing that number. So I'd like to now talk about a story, kind of where this journey began for me, in terms of thinking about it in a more of a framework way, rather than just going with my gut and thinking about how can I relate to other teams and understand them. All right, so this is actual footage of my first sales call as a marketer. And where I work at Go Nimbly, we have what's called a consultant-led sales motion. And what that means is we don't have a traditional sales team. And a lot of that's because our demo is our ability to talk about how we would approach gaps in the RevOps space. So it's very common for a senior leader of the company to take, let's say, an inbound lead and start the conversation with them. And then a consultant would join those conversations at some point to provide value and kind of get them unblocked and listen to think about the solution design as we work together in the prospect process. As luck would have it, there was a leadership offsite and there was a need to hop on a call with a prospect. And I was asked to join it solo. And being somebody that kind of likes to just jump into things, I said, yeah, I could do this myself. That's fine. It seemed like they had some very clear marketing operations gaps. And since that's sort of the side of things that I came up on, I thought, sure, like I could talk to them. I could definitely, add some value to that conversation, no problem. And of course, when the person joined, that wasn't true. They needed some very specific development skills in Apex and other sales ops stuff that I am somewhat familiar with, but I would not say was my bread and butter, if you will. So true to this meme, I started to sweat a little bit, maybe cried a little on the inside, and was feeling like, oh, this is so tough. And I remember just how tense I felt and kind of frantically going through the lead object in Salesforce, the lead layout. And it's one of those things where time kind of slows down, even though this probably all felt like 1 second. And I started to reflect on how much I thought I knew about what it's like to be a salesperson live on a sales call. Like I've really prided myself on making sure that naming conventions make sense, enabling sales teams, putting marketing information, not crowding it in areas that might create frustration for them when they're in this work. But I really didn't realize what that's like. And what's so interesting is there is a data enrichment tool that sales teams tend to use, and I always loathed it because it would always take over lead source, and that always frustrated me. and folks would bulk import records, and they would be tagged as like sales sourced, and then nothing would happen with those for years, and then marketing would re-engage them, but their lead source would be outbound. However, that tool gave me some really critical information here. I saw that the company had started in 2016. And so I was like, okay, how can I start to have the difficult questions in this sales call? Because it's towards the end, you really need to say like, hey, do you have budget for this? Like, what does that look like? And that's really hard. It's easy to talk about your product and services. You're in marketing, you're passionate about it. It's your right hand, but it's really hard to pivot to that. And, having that information from that other tool help change directions of the call. And I was basically able to ask some questions around like how they got this far without a RevOps partner or without really RevOps at their organization. And they essentially admitted that they're really ready for this. They see the value. And so it felt like for me to have a more pointed question at next steps and budget and things like that, it didn't feel like I was just kind of throwing something out of nowhere, and it felt very natural. And so things ended up working out well. I got a lot of praise internally, and that prospect ended up becoming a customer. So yay, everybody wins. But there were some things that I really thought about and reflected on. And the first is really that empathy piece. So I thought I knew what it was like to be a salesperson, but I actually didn't until I participated in that activity. I've always prided myself on being more of like an empathetic person. And, by definition, empathy is the ability to understand and share feelings with another. And, I really didn't understand what it was like to work in sales as somebody on the marketing side of things. And I think it's also important that we talk about the elephant in the room, like who cares about empathy or feelings? We're busy. We're MOPs pros. We're not just looking for extra stuff to do to fill our day. And it's really hard to care about other people and teams when we feel like we're not getting along very good with them. So I hear that. Also, my work BFF, Mike, I kind of went through the title of this presentation and he was like, I don't know about empathy. I don't think I would join that presentation. So thank you for everybody that's here, that's decided to join. I get how that term can be a little off-putting and confusing. So according to FBI negotiation expert Chris Voss, emotions are actually everything in negotiation. And he provides a framework called tactical empathy. And this framework's actually used strategically to diffuse a situation, to collaborate with the other person or party, and with the end goal of gathering as much information as possible. So it's about being interested in what drives the other side, even if you're not naturally motivated to. It's kind of showing that interest and showing the other person that you care and that you get where they're coming from. It can really unlock a lot in unexpected ways. And that's because ultimately you can't have trust without empathy, because when the other person or team feels understood by you, they inherently trust you. And when you have trust, you can work better together, you can get your ideas off the ground, and things like that. I've also noticed this theme of empathy showing up in a lot of other places, like in Kim Scott's book, Radical Candor, and The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins, which are pretty popular organizational leadership books. So at the end of the day, I realized how to feel heard and how to get my point across using empathy versus just like data. Because that was the thing for me, is I always thought, well, if I had cleaner data, if I had better dashboards, like I could really prove my ideas and my team's ideas, and we can get more off the ground. But I really wasn't expecting to learn just how much showing that you understand the perspective of another team, just how much you can get off the ground. All right, so that being said, I started to think about this idea of the tactical empathy, the strategic application. And, since I work with a lot of folks in the RevOps world, I thought, how can I make this more actionable and more easily digestible? And so I thought, well, I think there's really 3 components here. So the first component is showing interest in the other team. Like, what can you do to show another team that you really care about what they do and how they do it? And then like actively participating in what they do. So not just, asking questions, but like really showing them like, hey, you're here, you share the work. And then I think the third and most important thing is challenging directly. What I mean by this is you can't say yes to everything. I know that I've really struggled in my career to say no to things. It's a constant battle. And so challenging directly is a great way to say no and not just take on more. And we will definitely get into some examples of each of these 3 things in a way that you can walk out with a clear action plan. All right. So we're actually already at step 2, because step 1 was taking down that number, your engagement score. So the first thing you want to do with showing interest, and the ask here, is identify how you might show interest in the success of another team. And so for each of these slides, I'll take a step back here and say that these suggested activities are exactly that. They're suggestions, and they're just 3 for each. And they're sorted from probably more challenging to less challenging. So if you're like me, maybe don't pick the most challenging ones. And like at the end, like kind of think about that, because you're going to pick one from each of these 3 dynamics. So with customer journey mapping, what this looks like is when you get all the heads of the go-to-market teams and the ops teams in a room, and you map out the customer's entire journey from cookie to close one deal to cross-sell, upsell. And you think about like what that process is like and what the gaps that customer is feeling, what gaps your organization is feeling as those handoffs happen. It's a really great way to take a step up and say like, hey, I really care about the big picture here. Another thing you can do is informational interviews. And so I got a lot of great informational interview questions from the first 90 days. And essentially, what those look like is, and it's a little bit easier to do this if you have a recent promotion or you're new to a job, but you certainly don't have to be in that bucket. But it's where you just really interview as many folks as you can. So not just people above you, but lateral folks as well. You just say like, hey, what do you think are the biggest priorities of the business? What do you think are the biggest pains? What do you think are the most untapped areas of growth? And we'll start to see this theme shake out more. But it's not just interviewing or showing interest for the sake of showing interest. You're actually collecting some valuable information here. There's probably going to be a lot of information you collect in that informational interview process that relates to something that you want to get off the ground, a new tool, a new process, a pain that you've been seeing. And now you have the ability to say, you know what? My team and this other team both have this gap. Like, this is a priority. We really need to do this. So it's not just about just giving for the sake of giving. It's about collecting information. I can understand that for a lot of folks that might feel like kind of a lot. So another really cool thing you can do is a rep ride. What that looks like is you just sit with somebody from sales or customer success, and in the before times you might like sit behind them. But you can certainly do it over Zoom as well. And you just kind of say like, hey, can you take a sales call, or can you take a request, and I'll hop on and I'll just see kind of what you're looking at in the system, like what tools and processes you go through. And even though this might not be directly related to MOPS, if you're a MOPS pro, there might be some really useful information that you find, and you have some great ideas on how to enhance or improve or make things more efficiently. I find these activities, I'm always like, oh, did you know about this? Or did you know about that? Or, we translate naming conventions that people had no idea what they meant. So there's always some really great stuff that comes out of that. So to wrap things up, by showing interest, what's in it for you? You're going to gain valuable insight into the goals and objective of the team that are actually probably going to support your own team's objectives and roadmap. And the other team will actually see that you're interested in their challenges and objectives as well. All right, so next up, participate across teams. So the ask here is that you then actively engage in the tools, insights, strategies, and or enablement outside of your immediate team. There's a few different suggested activities here, similar to the last slide. They're kind of more challenging to less challenging. So the first is you could join a sales call like I did. I will say it's quite a bit different than watching a recording. Like, being live on a sales call is a very interesting experience. One that I really like is picking a SOPs tool to lead or own. So there's a lot of sales ops tools, or tools that we might think is more of a sales ops tool, that's actually really related to our success. So things that stand out here are like lead routing tools for sure. Things like Chili Piper, where it's a tool that's meant to give folks that fill out a demo form direct calendar access. Well, that helps marketing out because it's taking away that dance or that pain in that handoff, and then you're converting more MQLs into meetings and things like that. And with the lead routing piece, yeah, I mean, you probably wouldn't think, oh, that's for sure like a marketing thing. But if leads aren't getting correctly routed and assigned to the right person, well, first of all, that hurts marketing because you have less conversions. But second of all, you take the driver's seat on complaints about, junk coming from sales to marketing, or sorry, from marketing to sales. Another thing you can do is you can generate enablement and own the data dictionary. So I know with MOPS folks, we are really keen on understanding our naming convention, understanding the importance of a field, and understanding different terms, and really think about, hey, can I expand that to a larger data dictionary across the organization? And can my team not necessarily own the whole thing, but kind of be the director and pick owners across teams and things like that? There's a lot of ways that you can step up here and just really show that you care across the organization. So what's in it for you? Well, you get way ahead of major risks and setbacks. So, if you are taking ownership in tools, beyond like a clear MOPs tool, you have visibility into the larger organization's roadmap. And you might be able to get ahead of things or stop somebody before they do something crazy, like changing the way a field works. And most importantly, you're going to gain some skills to grow your career. I know that in my experience, I started off as more of a marketing specialist, and that had a great initial growth for me. And I think I've learned that as you become more of a generalist, it's another way to continue that growth and that momentum. All right, so the last step is challenging directly. And what we mean by challenging directly is the ability to say no in constructive ways. And this relates to something I read in Kim Scott's book, Radical Candor. And her idea is all about, having good rapport and good candor with related people and teams happens in two key areas. So the first is showing that you care. So I think that's we've already touched on that theme, but then also challenging them. And this builds trust. So if we think about someone in our lives that's always agreeing with us, always giving us praise, it's kind of like, can I be that good? And you'd be really surprised when you ask additional questions or you push back on things, how much folks will actually answer their own question and respect you along the way. So some suggested activities here are to maintain a roadmap across the go-to-market function. There are a number of free tools like Airtable and low-cost tools, and it's great to have a roadmap across those teams, because when someone has that shiny object and they just want to do that new thing, you could say, well, how does this fit into our roadmap? Or, what can we deprioritize to get that into the roadmap? And to be able to say that and have that conversation really enables you to think cross-functionally and not just say yes for everything. Another thing you want to do is challenge with options. I see this happen most often with scoring, especially with our current economic climate. We want to give sales as much as they can handle, and so there's always this like, hey, can we rip out scoring? And so instead of saying yes or no, you could even offer, for example, one, to review the scoring criteria with the requester. You could offer to create a test segment and review those results together. Or even say like, hey, what does it look like to have sign off from you and other stakeholders so we're all aligned on this? And so what you'll find is when you challenge with options, you're not always just saying no, but you're slowing the situation down. You're getting that other person to think more clearly through the ask. And then you're also bringing them into the solution process, and they suddenly realize that they're responsible as well for anything that could go wrong with what they're asking for. And the last thing is at the very least, you can respond with what and how instead of why or yes. And so I'm borrowing this from Chris Voss's book, but there's something universally across all cultures in the world where when we were 2 years old, we did something wrong and our parents said why, and it's very triggering. So you want to avoid the word why, and you can totally replace it with what or how. So sort of touches on this before, but you could say, well, what do you think the impact of removing the scoring criteria and everyone that breathes goes to sales? Like, what do you think that impact's going to be on the customer's experience? And so, sure, you could approach that with data. You could say we did that last year and, ops actually went down and we lost salespeople. Of course, you do want to take a data-driven approach, but I'm hoping you could see in this conversation the value of approaching it that way and appending your facts and your information with some good communication skills. So what's in it for you? Challenging the other team brings them into the solution process and prevents you or the other team from taking everything on. I know we've covered a lot today, and you're like, okay, where do I start? So, what I've done is I've summarized the 3 suggested activities from each slide here. So that way you can make sure you're not picking the hardest thing. You don't have to pick one from each category. I think that could be great, and give yourself 3 months to execute these and revisit your score. But even if you pick 1 or 2 and just make that a part of your plan over the next few months and then check in a few weeks later, I'd be very surprised if you didn't see any sort of uh lift in that score. So, you've done the work. You picked your things. You've implemented them over a few months, and you are revisiting your score and seeing if the needle moved. So, something to keep in mind here is that alignment is a process, it's not a destination. It's something that's constantly evolving and you're going to constantly need to invest in. But my hope is that you take some of these ideas and some of these actions into your daily process. And just like this meme, you feel a little bit better. Well, thanks so much for making it thus far. Really appreciate your time today. And I'll be hanging out here for a little bit to answer any questions you might have. You can definitely find me on LinkedIn if you have additional questions or ideas or feedback about today's presentation. Would love to hear that. I'm also the host of the How We RevOps podcast. We recently launched it, and we're always looking for obviously listeners, but also folks to join the podcast if you're interested. So definitely reach out. We go into more detail on things that we talked about today, like road mapping and customer journey mapping. I'm also a big fan of sharing my sources. So here's some suggested readings. I borrowed a lot of frameworks from this book to bring this whole thing together. And again, thank you so much for your time. And I hope that you enjoyed today's presentation. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for joining my presentation today. I hope you found it helpful. I am seeing some questions come in. So we can go ahead and post Jeff's question, which is, do you believe that being tactically empathetic requires deploying additional capacity? Like an instance where we're at full capacity, we have a decent rhythm, but maybe are working in silos. What kind of resource investment is applying your theory to a situation like that? I think this is a great question. And a struggle that we all have is like, how do we have more time? So my recommendation would be to start small. So, for example, you could try some of the smaller things that we talked about today. There's a really cool framework that I would like to share with the group. It's called Scale. So it's the S is status, the C is certainty, the A is autonomy, the L is likeness, and the E is equity. So, for example, you could go and say, hey, what is this person's status? Am I undermining it in the way that I speak or engage with them? How can I provide them more certainty? My favorite is the A, which is autonomy. It's like giving with options. We talked a little bit about this in one of the later slides. And so, for example, you don't have to start off with like reading Chris Voss's book on Never Split the Difference if you don't have that time, but you can start off with just providing an option, like I said. So you can start really small and just say, you know what, once a week, instead of saying yes or no, I'm going to provide 3 options to a stakeholder. I'm going to start from there. You'll get a rhythm and you could build more. Additionally, you could, once you get more comfortable with this, bring the whole team in, use your stand-up meetings and things like that to get, and just set one small goal a week is a good way to get that momentum. So we got another question with somebody with my same last name. And so I'm hearing a lot about bandwidth. I think one thing you could do is, again, focus on something small if you have a weekly, a bi-weekly, or monthly stand-up, just kind of take your group and just say, hey, what's one thing that we could do to show interest? What's one thing that we like, tiny thing that we could do to participate, even if it's 5 minutes of just sitting with someone on a different team and saying, hey, can you just show me what you see on this lead or contact layout or something like that? It doesn't have to be huge and orchestrated. It's really about, it's those small consistent things where you're just remembering, to put yourself out there and to learn about what's going on outside of your immediate team. Okay, and it looks like there's a question from Autumn. When trying to align 100 plus salespeople, we're thinking through training gaps, campaign implementations, and marketing and sales collaboration. Where do you believe is the best place to start to gain the most impact? So my recommendation here is, so you kind of have two areas, right? And there's a challenge because you're dealing with a sales team of 100 and not a sales team of 5, right? So you don't have time to sit with all of them. In this case, I would try to, I'm pretty sure with large organizations, or at least in my experience, there's these regular kind of like stand-up calls, and they typically happen once a week. There's not a ton of value. You're just kind of going through the motions. Swap one of those out with an open-ended discussion on gaps. Like, what are the gaps that we're feeling? And it doesn't, if you're in marketing and you're talking to the sales team, it doesn't have to be like, what are the gaps that the sales team's feeling from marketing? It could be about their own gaps. And I'm pretty sure if you just had like a post-it session or just something a little more open-ended that wasn't just going through the motions of a status call, some information would shake loose that would really help give you the direction on where to start and what the biggest priorities are to gain that early momentum. All right, so Olivia had a question. How do you manage up the organization to ensure that marketing and sales leaders are also having this operational empathy? Well, the thing is you don't have to, like, this is what I really learned from the whole Chris Voss thing. So when he's diffusing negotiations with tactical empathy, which is strategically letting the other side know you understand how they feel and what's going on, and you're collecting the information to kind of unlock the situation, the other person's not trained and they're in a very stressful situation and it's very high pressure. So it doesn't require everybody to be on the same page, or everybody, it's not like a framework where everybody needs to know the ins and outs. Like, it's meant for you to understand the ins and outs and lead with it in a way that actually benefits you. And it doesn't require the other side. The idea is that more and more when people on the other end feel understood, they tend to open up more, give you more information, trust you more. It's not like Rome was built in a day and you're gonna, ask what or how instead of why next time, and the whole thing is gonna work out. But it's kind of interesting how we move past feeling like everything's an arm wrestle if you take some of the content here in your communication strategy. All right, there's a question from Victoria. Knowing alignment is a process, how often do you recommend checking in your team's engagement scores with other teams? So it's sort of, I think the most important thing here is that there's this combination of small steps and we're playing the long game here. So I know that if you are looking for like an overnight thing, you're not going to see it. So ideally, I would give it probably like a month or 2, maybe 3 before you check back in. Give it time to really think about how things are going, because it's like, if you're on a fitness journey and you're checking the scale every day, losing a pound isn't going to be a big deal one day to the next. But if you wait a month or 2 or 3 and you're consistent, you're going to be pretty surprised by that result. All right. Any additional questions? I'd really love to provide any clarity for anybody. I know this is a little bit of a different angle than we typically hear with alignment. We're focused a little bit more on the strategy and less on like shared goals and things like that. If I didn't fully answer anyone's question or they have a follow-up, they can also post that in the comments. I'd be more than happy to go more in depth with folks. Thank you, John. Admittedly, behind the scenes, I was a little nervous. This is my first big presentation, and I really wanted to provide some value for folks. Automass, if there's any other books I recommend, yes. So I love anything by Justin Kerr. So he has How to Be a Boss, How to Write an Email, How to Be Great at Your Job. They're all like under 100 pages, and they are wonderful books that I love a book where I don't have to read it cover to cover. I can kind of pick it out of my closet or out of my Kindle library. And there's just some really helpful, like quick communication tips, like using bullets and, kind of leading with the ask and just all sorts of stuff you're going to read and be like, darn, I wish I knew about this 5 years ago. Because the reality is so much of our world isn't just the outputs and the KPIs and the results, but it's just kind of how we engage with each other and have those good footings. Trying to think of some other books that I really like. I just always Nonviolent Communication is a great one. And yeah, I'm definitely Addicted to the Process is a really good one. I don't remember the author, but it's kind of about sales and how in difficult conversations we tend to want to just go off on a tangent. And so it's kind of about like being prepared and just kind of staying the course. I think is really helpful, even if you don't work in sales. But I think we've all been in those big all hands where you think like, I got this, I'm gonna go up there, and then you kind of just go off and you're like, uh-oh, like where do I go? But yeah. And it looks like CC said, not a question, just a great call out on us being last name twins. All right. Well, I'm not seeing a lot more comments come through. So just wanted to wrap things up, say thanks again. Probably one of the best places to find me is on LinkedIn. Send me a message. I'd be happy to answer any questions. If people get stuck along the way, they try to implement one of these, and they kind of need some help or guidance, I'd be more than happy to provide it. And yeah, I hope that you feel a little bit better about being empathetic. Thanks, everyone.